So this is the video for Remember by Christina Rossetti. A few things to say before we get into the actual text itself. So in terms of the form of poem you've got here, it is a sonnet, but more specifically than that, it is what we would call a Petrarchan sonnet. So, if you're going to write Petrarchan, by the way, you will need to use a capital P. And the reason being is that we call it Petrarchan because this all comes from an Italian poet in the 14th century called Francesco Petrarca. And so it's Petrarchan. And Petrarchan sonnets are different to Shakespearean sonnets. If you do Sonnet 116 in this anthology, you'll know with the Shakespearean sonnet, you essentially have three quatrains followed by a couplet. Well, that's not the case here. What we're looking at more is having a volta, a turning point partway through, after which the mood, tone, message, excuse me, shifts quite noticeably. And we'll also see, in this case, a shift in the use of the rhyme scheme as well. Um, the other thing to say is that the poet Christina Rossetti lived in the 19th century. Now, you're not expected to write about the poet's biographical context. However, I think you're going to see as we go through this that it does have an impact and is detectable in some of what's going on in terms of like social convention or perhaps in gender roles as well. So that's worth keeping in mind. Um, in terms of the situation depicted here in the poem, there's ambiguity. The temptation with poetry, and it's people are correct to do this often, but the temptation is to automatically assume that the poetic voice, the narrator, and the poet are one and the same person. And some students get a bit confused by what I mean by that. Well, you don't always have to write from your actual perspective in life. One of the things about great writers is that some of them can write very convincingly as other people. I mean, I'm a middle aged Englishman. If I was a really skilled writer, perhaps I could convincingly write the text or a text from the perspective of a very elderly woman in, I don't know, Italy, or I could write very convincingly from the perspective of a 10-year-old boy in Argentina, something like that. You can make these big leaps. And I think a lot of people are tempted to think, well, this is definitely Rossetti in this poem. Well, Rossetti never got married in her own life. She had various suitors, people who wanted to marry her, but it didn't happen. And what I would say is, I think it's reasonable to infer, so to read between the lines in this poem, to make a judgment based on the information available to you, but not necessarily knowing it's definite. It's reasonable to infer that the poetic voice is addressing, meaning speaking to someone that they are married to or have been in a relationship with, and that the poetic voice is dying. I also think, at least for me, that it's reasonable to infer that it is the woman in the relationship who's dying, and we'll see the evidence for that once we get into the text. Now, I was talking about the form earlier, and it being a Petrarchan sonnet. This is quite interesting to me, and I think Rossetti is quite innovative here. She's doing something quite unusual, and when I think of sonnets in the past, I think that quite often some sonnets were written about desire and wanting someone romantically and trying to woo them to kind of persuade them, and often hyperbolically, exaggeratedly praising them. And so I've often thought, or at least in my head, I have this notion of sonnets traditionally, a lot of them being about seeking to instigate a relationship. And I think this is quite the antithesis, in that this sonnet is about bringing a relationship to an end. So I think that's quite innovative. That's quite unusual what Rossetti's done here. Anyway, let's get into the text. So it begins with remember me, which is an imperative verb, a command, and that you do see that crop up three times quite early on. I say quite early on. Sonnets obviously 14 lines long, and although this is all one stanza, we tend to divide this into what we call the octave and the sestet. So you have your first 8 lines, so that would be down to the last one would be this line beginning with it, and then the sestet, the last 6, would begin with yet. And so in the octave you get the imperative verb remember me on 3 occasions, albeit the last instance has only before that. Now, remember me when I'm gone away, it sounds as if a command to keep on thinking of her after she is dead. So in the octave, there's this desire to continue to be a part of the lover or the husband who's left behind's life, and to remain prominent in his mind, in our mind. Gone away sounds quite euphemistic. Euphemistic. What do I mean by that? I imagine some of you are saying. Well, euphemism, euphemism, is a way of making something harsh or severe sound less so. So quite often when people die, we say they've passed away. It sounds a little less horrible. And when I'm gone away, the euphemism there could be that they are kind of in denial about what's going to happen to them to a certain degree, or that they're trying to cushion that blow, to play it down somewhat, to soften it for the addressee, for the lover or the husband that they're leaving behind. And it then says gone far away into the silent land. And silent land, I think you could say, is a euphemistic metaphor for death. It's quite interesting because I think silent land can be quite divisive in what people think that it is suggestive of, and you could even say that you think that it's kind of multifaceted, that it's doing multiple things at the same time. Some people find the prospect of a silent land terrifying, like it's a vacuum of nothingness, and I guess that's a big thing for humans, is that fear of the unknown that comes with death. However, some people talk about finding it appealing, and that it sounds tranquil, at least. So you could maybe argue that there's ambiguity there about exactly whether it's something to be feared or desired. You could even argue that it's capturing the duality of death, that death is restful but also frightening in the sense that no one knows what's on that other side. And then we get into this third line, when you can no more hold me by the hand. Now, I find it really interesting that this poem, nearly 20 years ago now, was voted as one of the UK's favourites in a BBC poll. And I think one of the reasons that it was voted as one of Britain's favourite poems is because a lot of people focus on a message towards the end of the poem of selfless love, of letting go the partner who's left behind, living on. But I do actually think that the poem is tinged with some resentment. And I mentioned Rossetti being a 19th century poet. And I think there is some evidence that even though the poetic voice is addressing someone they love, that there is still some kind of bitterness towards them, about the hierarchy, the power dynamic in their relationship and how it was uneven. And I think Rossetti is very clever in capturing this ambivalence, these mixed feelings, because I do think it is possible, and I think a lot of people will probably agree that you can love someone yet still harbour some kind of resentment or some kind of little grudges with them. When it says when you can no more hold me by the hand, her wording isn't when we can no longer hold hands, which would suggest a kind of parity and equality between them. But it does sound like maybe there's some restriction there on a level, about hold me by the hand when you can no longer kind of be the one leading me and to an extent controlling. The reason you're probably detecting a bit of apprehension in my voice is because I do think there is another interpretation as well. And again, this is capturing kind of how mixed feelings can be in relationships. If you think that the poetic voice is dying, then we sometimes hold the hand of people who are dying in order to comfort them. And you could argue that it's evocative of that image of someone at a person's bedside when they know they're essentially on their deathbed. But I think it's really clever what Rossetti's doing here with the ambiguity, holding hands, traditionally a romantic image, but could also be one of control. And don't forget that like parents hold the hand of their child, one because they love them, but two because they are seeking to guide and to protect them and they are in control. But it could also be that one of comfort when someone's dying. So really interesting. Into the fourth line, nor I half turn to go, yet turning stay. Now I think that image of someone not knowing whether they're coming or going works on a couple of levels as well. The poetic voice, the narrator, obviously knows that they are dying. So they may feel that there's a kind of liminality and in between quality to where they are at the moment. They're going to be dead very soon. They can't carry on living their life as they normally were. They're in almost like a transitional stage. But I think it could also be capturing that idea quite subtly of mixed feelings about it. If you think that we said that Silent Land could be appealing, could be frightening, could be a bit of both, then this kind of indecision that's captured through this image could be continuing that idea of mixed feelings. When we get into line 5, remember me when no more day by day. I've had conversations with colleagues about this and they've been quite interesting. No more day by day. The phrasing there, you could argue that there's some resentment almost captured in that, in the sense that there's maybe like a monotony, a repetitive quality to it. Day by day, you were telling me of our future. I mean, it could be positive in the sense that they had these great plans together, but then it could also be that the partner who's going to continue living's voice was the dominant one. Um, and then what I find really interesting as we're getting towards the latter stages of this, I'd say, you tell me. Now, tell as a verb choice there, I think, is indicative of the partner being the one in control, being the kind of senior partner in that relationship. And there's also an interesting juxtaposition of contrast here. And I think you tell me of our, so that's shared, isn't it, of our future that you planned. So even though it's a future that they share, it's only the one partner who actually decides what's going to be included in that. And so I think very subtly, this is maybe alluding to 19th century gender roles. We're talking about a time when those would have been a lot more defined and strict and rigid, and that was even reflected in the law. There were laws that were passed in the 19th century to start changing things. The two laws come to mind: the Married Women Property Acts, I think, of 1817, 1882, started to change the law so that women had more autonomy, more control over their own lives. However, by modern day standards, it's still a very patriarchal society. So I think you get an indication of the power dynamic and perhaps the broader social expectations for the separate sexes indicated there quite subtly, but in you tell me of our future that you planned. And then only remember me, you understand, it will be late to counsel then or pray. Basically saying at that point, you won't be able to make any difference to my death. To counsel in that sense is to advise, to pray might be to try and ask for that divine intervention for the poetic voice to be saved. Now, I mentioned about this being a Petrarchan sonnet earlier on, and we're about to get the Volta VOLTA. Doesn't need a capital V. I see a lot of students writing it with a capital V, doesn't need one. It's the turning point. And I think you could have probably reached that conclusion quite easily yourself, because you get yet, which I think is indicative of the argument now going the other way. It's essentially a different form of but. Yeah, if you should forget me for a while. So now contemplating fading in the partner or the husband's memory, something that was seemingly unthinkable because we had the repetition of remember me, remember me, remember me, which arguably the repetition of that imperative verb sounded a bit desperate and anxious. There's now the Volta, the shift in tone and message, where actually the poet was saying, I'm going to contemplate what it will be like after I'm gone, and if you continue to mourn for me and grieve for me really intensely. Yeah, if you should forget me for a while and afterwards remember, do not grieve. Now, the shift in imperative is really dramatic. We've gone from remember me to do not grieve. This is the antithesis, the opposite message. For if the darkness and corruption leave a vestige of the thoughts that once I had, better by far you should forget and smile. Now, darkness and corruption, there's some ambiguity here, I think, with the corruption. Darkness, I would imagine, is symbolic of death, and perhaps those the bad times towards the end, marring the surviving partner's memory of the deceased. The corruption maybe is that these memories become distorted and corrupted. A vestige, you can see the definition here, a trace or remnant of something that's disappearing, no longer exists. So if the darkness and corruption leave a vestige of the thoughts that once I had, better by far you should forget and smile. I think the poetic voice is alluding to that desperate pleading of remember me, remember me, remember me, saying if that lingers on in your mind and causes you to be depressed and upset and to tarnish what remains of your life, then actually what I want you to do is to jettison, to get rid of those feelings so it doesn't spoil the life you've got left. I mentioned that BBC poll earlier about how this made it into the nation's 100 favourite poems. This is the part that I think a lot of people really like, which is it's if you love someone, you set them free. You say, I'm not going to be around, but I want you to be happy in the remainder of your life. And I think that's the really appealing bit to a lot of people. But I honestly think that there should be attention paid to the idea that there is some subtle resentment earlier on in the poem. Better by far you should forget and smile than that you should remember and be sad. In those last two lines, there appear to be kind of like two pathways forward for the future: enjoying life by smiling, or being sad. And they're saying, I want you to go down the much more positive pathway. So that's the poem really covered, apart from, I would say, just drawing your attention to the rhyme scheme that you might want to talk about. I mentioned earlier Petrarchan sonnet, 14 lines, turning point of Volta. If you look at the rhyme scheme, let's look at the octave. So that's the first 8 lines. Okay, so we're talking about here. And you can see that away and stay go together. So you could call those both A, land and hand, B. So you could say you've got A, B, B, A. Now you then get exactly the same rhyme scheme coming up in day, pray, planned, and understand. So the octave is basically ABBA twice, A, B, B, A twice. You then get into the sestet, and you can see that you've got grieve and leave, and you've got had and sad. But the rhyme scheme has changed. Things have shifted. If you were going to annotate this, having done ABBA twice for the octave, you would probably put a C next to while, and then you'd say, well, that goes with smile, but that is not in the same pattern. that it would have been earlier on. You would expect that to come a line earlier. So you say that while and smile are C, you've got grieve and leave, which you'd probably say were both D's, and then had and sad, you would probably say E. So you then have, or you'd have C, D, D, E, C, E. It's shifted. The rhyme scheme has shifted, and you don't just want to be a technique spotter, but I think what you could put in an essay is that the sentiment in the poem definitely shifts after the Volta, dramatically so, from remember me to do not grieve and I want you to be happy. But you could argue that the rhyme scheme changing is also indicative of that shift in mood. It reflects how life is going to change, how the feelings of the dying or wife have changed here as well. So it's this shift, it's all about the shift, the change. And I think the rhyme scheme helps to signify that. And now, obviously, with the poetry anthology, you're probably going to be asking yourself, well, what other poems from the collection should I be partnering this with if it comes up in the exam? And there are, I think, 4 really that jump out. And I'll talk about how to compare them at a broadly thematic level. So Piano by D.H. Lawrence, I think, would be a good partner for Remember. Now, Piano is narrated from the perspective of someone who is led down memory lane about remembering their dead mother, and it has a really destructive effect on them. The poetic voice is weeping like a child for the past by the end, and it shows how those memories cause them a great deal of pain because they very acutely, very keenly realize how much they miss that period of their life, how much they miss the protection, the guidance that the mother provided, and they yearn to go back to it. So they're both to do with memories of people who love loved ones who have died. But in the case of Piano, the poetic voice is really hurt by those memories, and they didn't really want to engage with them. It was the music that tricked them into remembering, that triggered those memories. I think going into a little bit more detail, you could talk about the importance of form in them both. We've spoken a lot about the Petrarchan sonnet form here. Form was also important in Piano. You had those 3 quatrains, each composed of 2 rhyming couplets, which gave it a melodic feel, which was replicating the idea of music, which was key in triggering the memory. Whereas here, form is also important, but for different reasons. It allows you to see the Volta and a dramatic shift in sentiment, but also is quite innovative in the sense that it's the ending of a relationship being captured in a form that has been known for being used in attempting to instigate relationships to start them. Another poem would be Poem at 39, because that is a daughter processing her memories and reconciling her feelings of her deceased father, who's, that's another dead loved one, isn't it? But in that case, Alice Walker's poetic voice, it feels positive by the end, and actually strong in the sense that she is confident that her father, were he alive today, would actually be very proud of her, and she's happy as a consequence. I think in terms of form, that is very different to Remember. Remember's got this very established Petrarchan sonnet form, whereas Alice Walker deliberately employed an erratic stream of consciousness free verse form in order to convey the idea that the poetic voice was processing thoughts and feelings. And I guess you could talk about how there does seem to be a turning point in that poem. there's the how I miss my father full stop at the beginning, and then the much more emotionally intense how I miss my father exclamation mark, which some students say is a Volta. And then by the end, there's positivity with the introduction of the only two rhymes in the poem, look and cook and admire and fire, which suggests that she's reaching some kind of harmony in her feelings. So that's a positive ending, like the ending of Remember is positive. Another very obvious comparative partner would be Shakespeare's Sonnet 116, because you can talk about the nature of love in them both. This Remember is almost suggesting that part of love is letting go and accepting the end and allowing the other partner to be free to maybe even to find love again. This idea of love coming to an end, I do think is captured in Sonnet 116, because that's talking about true love. And it basically suggests that true love through life is steadfast and holds strong if it's real, and will continue to the edge of doom to when life comes to an end, and that true love doesn't alter up until that point. Obviously, they're both sonnets. You can talk about Shakespeare's sonnet being different in the sense that it seems to be posing a question, as a lot of Shakespearean sonnets do, about what is the nature of true love. And rather than being like the Petrarchan sonnet, we have octave, sestet, and the Volta signifying a shift in message. What Shakespeare has is it's almost like essay-like in a way, 3 quatrains exploring the argument and considering things, and then the conclusion is made that bit more emphatic by being different in that it is a rhyming couplet. So I think there's a rich opportunity there in terms of comparing how form is important in both of them, but for different reasons. But you could also argue that they both kind of reach a conclusion by the end, because Rossetti's is realizing that actually it's better to let them go and encourage them to be happy, having previously thought that they wanted to be remembered. And then the last comparative partner, I think, is Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. The very common link between the two is that someone is dying in both of these poems. However, in Dylan Thomas's poem, it's a son talking to his father who's about to die. So it's the one who's going to carry on living who's actually speaking, whereas in Rossetti's poem, it's the one who's doing the dying who's narrating. What's interesting is that the message is very different. Rossetti's Remember comes to accept the death, whereas Dylan Thomas's poetic voice is encouraging resilience and defiance up till the very end, imploring the father to fight against death for as long as he can. So they're quite different in that sense. You could also talk about form being important in that poem as well. No doubt your teacher will have talked to you about the villanelle form there, so you could talk about how that would be a known form and how it helps to capture that idea of having energy and pushing on and being vigorous even until the end. And here, and Remember, you've also got another widely recognised form, but for different reasons. So I think they're definitely comparable poems that you could get a good essay out of as well.